Good day, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the FAO Framework for Action on Biodiversity for Food and Agriculture and the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This is one of a series of webinars that the CBD Secretariat and the co-chairs and the chairs of the various subsidiary bodies under the convention are organizing in preparation for the very important meetings which will take place in March, the resumed sessions of the convention subsidiary bodies, SBSTA and SBI, and the working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. As you know, this will be a key step in preparing the post-2020 framework and other decisions for COP15 Part 2 later this year. I'm very pleased that this particular webinar is being organized jointly by the CBD Secretariat and FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. We have a long history of cooperation, very positive cooperation between the convention and FAO on the role of biodiversity in food and agriculture. So today, our colleagues from FAO will present the FAO framework for action on biodiversity for food and agriculture, which was developed through the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture of FAO, and then recently endorsed by the FAO Council. The framework for action is essentially a policy response to the excellent report of FAO, the State of the World's Biodiversity for Food and Agriculture. And indeed, the CBD COP back in Cancun in 2016 was, before the report was finished, proposed that FAO develop such a policy response to the report, recognizing that it would be an important instrument in helping to mainstream biodiversity in the food and agriculture sector and in contributing to the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So these are the recent developments, but in fact, the cooperation, as I mentioned, between FAO and CBD goes back a long way. Back in 1996, FAO developed the first report on the state of the world's plant genetic resources and the Global Plan of Action on Plant Genetic Resources. And shortly after that, the CBD Conference of the Parties recognized the importance of this plan of action for the convention and began the development of what became the program of work on biodiversity for food and agriculture, looking at all of the components of biodiversity, why it's important for supporting productive and sustainable agriculture, and also looking at how the management of the food and agriculture can impact biodiversity. So I'm very pleased to have on this panel today the chair of the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, Ms. Deidre January from Namibia, and also the past chair, Francois Pitou, and the chair of one of the co-chairs of the small group that developed and negotiated the FAO framework, Desterio Niamonga from Namibia. We also have the Secretary of the Commission, Irene Hoffman, and Julie Belanger, the Technical Officer who led the work on the State of the World's Biodiversity for Food and Agriculture. I'm also very happy that we have our co-chairs from the CBD side of the working group, Basil Van Aave, and Francis Ogwell. But to start, I'd like to turn to my dear friend and colleague, Maria Elena Semedo, the Deputy Director General of FAO, for some opening remarks. Maria Elena, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. Very happy to co-chair this event with you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear participants. It's indeed a great pleasure to welcome you to this event. And let me start by thanking the CBD Secretariat, in particular Elizabeth Maruma Marema, the Executive Secretary of the Convention, her deputy, David Cooper, for co-hosting this event on FAO Framework for Action on Biodiversity for Food and Agriculture. Let me also take this opportunity to thank the co-chairs of the open-ended working group on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, Mr. Basil Van Havre and Mr. Francis Ogwal, for joining us. And last but not least, let me thank the chair of the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, Mrs. Deidre January, and Francois Pitou, former chair of the Commission and Special Envoy for Sustainable Agriculture from Switzerland, for being with us, always very supportive. Let me also thank my colleagues, Irene Hoffman and all the colleagues from FAO, working and contributing for the organization of this webinar. As you all know, FAO is fully committed to the sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity, as exemplified over recent years, first by the creation of the Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment, the adoption of FAO strategy on mainstreaming biodiversity across agriculture sectors, and the adoption of the Framework for Action on Biodiversity for Food and Agriculture. And at the same time, FAO is co-leading with UNEP, the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration 2021-2030. With this, I must say that biodiversity is at the heart of FAO new strategic framework 2022-2031, which is underpinned by 4 betters: better production, better nutrition, better environment, and a better life, leaving no one behind. And we can say that biodiversity is not only at the heart, but it is the foundation of the 4 betters. FAO members have sent a strong message that the organization should contribute to the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. FAO has long been a close partner for CBD, for example, as lead agency of the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Pollinators, the International Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Soil Biodiversity, and as a key partner in the program of work on agricultural biodiversity. The International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources, the International Plant Protection Convention, are members of the Biodiversity Liaison Group. In July 2021, FAO and the CBD convened a global dialogue on the whole of food and agriculture in the Global Biodiversity Framework, which brought together, it was for the second time because you had organized already a previous one, we brought together stakeholders from the various sectors of agriculture, from the environment and biodiversity sectors, to discuss the sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity in the context of agri-food system, and also as a contribution to the post-2020. There is a growing recognition that food and agriculture and biodiversity are critically interlinked. Agriculture, in our definition, which is crop and livestock production, forestry, fisheries and aquaculture, is both a major driver of biodiversity loss and a major beneficiary of biodiversity. There is an urgent need to address the negative impacts that agriculture has on biodiversity and to make better use of biodiversity as a sustainable resource for agriculture. And there are many examples of methods and approaches that can make food production more biodiversity friendly or that utilize biodiversity to make agri-food system more resilient and adapted to the climate crisis, and also to be a sustainable source for healthy diet and sustainable livelihood, safer for workers, less damaging to the environment, and less reliant on non-renewable inputs. These methods and approaches are attracting greater interest, and their implementation is generally increasingly globally. However, the ongoing crisis facing biodiversity indicates that we're not there yet. Much more needs to be done, faster and at a greater scale. We need to reinforce efforts to address constraints to implementation, to ensure that resources are made available, knowledge gaps addressed, commitment from governments strengthened, and cooperation promoted at all levels. The framework for action on biodiversity for food and agriculture, a global policy response to FAO's report on the state of the world's biodiversity for food and agriculture, is the outcome of 5 years of discussion and negotiation by members and observers of the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. And it was adopted by FAO Council in the last Council in December 2021. It sets out agreed action across 3 strategic priority areas. First, characterization, assessment, and monitoring. Second, management, encompassing sustainable use and conservation. And third, institutional framework. And we are very pleased today we have this opportunity to present and to share with you the framework for action, and in particular to discuss its link to the global biodiversity framework and its relevance to meetings resuming in Geneva in March. FAO really wants to be proactive. You want to contribute what we have, and also to bring the agri-food system to this debate and how they can be more resilient and more sustainable, and how we can conserve and protect our biodiversity. Dear participants, dear friends, dear colleagues, I wish you a fruitful and enriching discussion, and I thank you for your participation. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Maria Elena. And yeah, you emphasized that FAO is now putting biodiversity at the heart of its work, because biodiversity is at the heart of food production, nutrition, livelihoods, and the economy. And of course, we know also that the way we manage food and agriculture is of critical importance for biodiversity. The most important sector affecting the future of biodiversity. So thank you for highlighting this sort of two-way relationship, how better management of biodiversity can support food and agriculture, and how improving our management of food and agriculture can help us reduce the impacts on biodiversity and help us lead towards the long-term vision for living in harmony with nature. And also thanks for outlining what else needs to be done and the role of both the FAO framework and, of course, the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework in reaching those important elements of mobilizing the resources, improving the knowledge, and putting everything in place that we need to get the transformative changes that we need. We're now going to have a presentation of the framework itself, and followed by some reflections from different country perspectives, and then reflections from, on the one hand, the CBD Post-2020 co-chairs, and on the other hand, from the chair of the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture of FAO. After that, there will be opportunity to address some of your questions. If you'd like to pose a question to any of the panelists, then please put your question in the questions box, which you can find on the GoToWebinar control panel. We will see those questions and respond to them either in writing or through the panel discussion later on. So now it's my pleasure to invite Irene Hoffman, the Secretary of the Commission, and Julie Belanger, the Technical Officer in the Commission, to provide us with an outline of the new FAO Framework for Action on Biodiversity for Food and Agriculture. Irene and Julie, over to you.
Thank you very much, David. As was already mentioned, when the Council at the end of last year adopted the Framework for Action on Food and Agriculture, it also asked the Secretariat to bring this to the attention of the parties to the Convention and invited them to consider this framework as an important contribution to the Global Biodiversity Framework. The CBD Secretariat has very kindly made our submissions available as information documents, and we are very pleased to describe today to you a little bit of the background and also the framework. The Commission is an intergovernmental body hosted by FAO. It was established in 1983, and since 1995 deals with all components of biodiversity of relevance to food and agriculture. It's the only permanent intergovernmental body that specifically addresses the entire biological diversity relevant for food and agriculture. And it offers a unique platform for its members and other stakeholders to promote a world without hunger by fostering the use and the development of the portfolio of this biodiversity that's important for food security and rural poverty. The Commission has currently 178 nations and the European Union as its members, and as both David and Maria Elena said, there has been a very long history of cooperation with the conventions. There have been many recommendations by the commissions to bring its recommendations, instruments, and tools to the CBD's attentions, and as David said, also the recognition by the CBD of these instruments. Next, the Commission aims to conserve biodiversity for food and agriculture and promote its use in support of global food security and sustainable development for present and future generations. It usually follows a work cycle, and since its establishment, the Commission has overseen and guided the preparation of global assessments, and as I mentioned, negotiated major instruments, including the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. These global assessments are country-driven. They are based on national assessments and looking at the drivers, the state of the resources. And then as a second step, the Commission Secretariat compiles those into assessment reports, which we have so far done on plant, animal, forest, and aquatic genetic resources, and now on biodiversity for food and agriculture. Then the Commission addresses the main gaps and challenges identified in the assessments through policy responses, which are the global plans of action on plant, animal, forest, and aquatic genetic resources, and instruments like the framework for action. The Commission then helps countries implement those instruments with tools and guidance. And finally, it has monitoring systems in place through dedicated databases that report to the Sustainable Development Goals, but also are used by the Convention for the monitoring of specific targets. The process to prepare the State of the World's Biodiversity for Food and Agriculture was similar to the other assessments, but it was the first integrated assessment that looks at all the biodiversity that is relevant for food and agriculture. As usual with this type of processes, it took quite a long time. The preparation started in 2013 with country reports, and the final report was published in 2019 based on 91 country reports. But in parallel to the preparation of the assessment report, there were already negotiations starting in 2016 to identify the main needs, gaps, and priorities to address the issues that were identified in the global assessment. And these finally led to the adoption by the FAO Council in December 21 of the Framework for Action on Biodiversity for Food and Agriculture. I will now hand over to my colleague Julie to present some of the key messages from the report and also introduce the framework.
Thank you, Irene, and greetings to all participants. Okay, so I see, yes, thank you. Can you show the next slide, please? Seems we have a slight problem with the presentation as we see the interface. So I will continue. Next slide, please. Sorry, the slide number 8, yes, this one, thank you. Okay, so as mentioned, the focus of the report is the biodiversity that is relevant to food and agriculture, and therefore it represents a subset of all biodiversity. So within agriculture, livestock, fisheries, forestry, and aquaculture systems, the report looks at the genetic resources upon which agriculture depends, the species that end up on our plates, but also those that do not, but provide critical services that we depend upon, such as pollinators, soil biodiversity, natural enemies of pests, etc. It also looks at ecosystems like rangelands, forests, or wetlands that supply a range of ecosystem services on which food and agriculture depend. So to complement the other assessments that were undertaken on plant, animal, forest, and aquatic genetic resources, the report focuses on the integrated management of all the biodiversity within agri-food systems. Next slide, please. So key messages include the following. So most components of biodiversity for food and agriculture are under threat and are declining, although there are important knowledge gaps that need to be filled. The main causes that are identified are changes in land and sea use, overexploitation of resources and species, climate change, pollution, including from the over or misuse of agricultural inputs, and invasive alien species. So these findings are in line with the findings of other assessments, like the global assessment of the BES, the GBO5, and other assessments. And although each report has a different angle or methodology, here, for example, the report is overseen by a body that is primarily representing the agricultural sectors. They all stress the need to address the loss of biodiversity with transformative changes or towards sustainability. Next slide, please. Another finding, so the report finds that in situ and ex situ conservation efforts are increasing, although unevenly across regions and sectors, and there are important gaps in coverage. Next slide, please. On the positive sides, as mentioned previously, the report finds an overall increase in the adoption of over 20 practices and approaches at genetic, plot, pond, farm, agricultural unit to ecosystem, seascape, landscape levels. For example, agroforestry, integrated approaches to plant nutrient and to pest management, agroecology, restoration, sustainable forest management, or ecosystem approach to fisheries, for example. So although the reporting countries generally see these approaches as being biodiversity friendly, and this is what we can see on the right side of the screen, it's a perception from countries of the impact on biodiversity of those practices, they also emphasize the need for more research and the need for support to help producers or planners or whoever is involved in these practices to transition to these often knowledge-intensive practices and approach to food production. And overall, enabling frameworks remain insufficient. Next slide, please. So to address these gaps, the Commission negotiated the framework. Next slide, please. Which has as objective to create a contextual framework for the coherent and consistent implementation of instruments and actions for relevant biodiversity for food and agriculture. It aims to promote transition towards more sustainable agri-food systems, contribute to the achievement of the SDGs and the implementation of the global biodiversity framework, to raise awareness of the importance of biodiversity in the context of food and agriculture, and to set the conceptual basis for the development and the adoption of national policies, legislations, and programs. The framework complements the global plans of actions that we mentioned before on crop, animal, forest, and aquatic genetic resource, and it focuses on integrated management approaches at production system, ecosystem, landscape, and seascape levels that make sustainable use of and conserve and restore biodiversity while improving livelihoods and supporting economic performance and healthy ecosystems. Next slide, please. The framework stresses the need to implement practical approaches and actions to improve the management of biodiversity, with a strong emphasis on cooperation and collaboration at all levels. So the framework is articulated around 3 strategic priority areas that together contain over 50 individual actions that cover the entire management cycle for biodiversity for food and agriculture, from characterization and monitoring to sustainable use and to conservation within suitable and enabling institutional frameworks. Next slide, please. So the rationale behind strategic priority 1.1 is that there is a need to improve knowledge of several components of biodiversity for food and agriculture and on their roles in the supply of ecosystem services. As mentioned before, there is also a need to better understand the impacts on biodiversity of sustainable but also of unsustainable production approaches, and to evaluate the extent to which biodiversity-friendly practices are being used. So in response to these needs, 10 actions are included under this strategic priority 1.1 to improve availability of and access to information on biodiversity for food and agriculture. So these actions are aggregated here on the screen at a higher level. And overall, they aim to improve monitoring and assessment, to reduce on the topics for which needs are expressed, to reduce knowledge gaps on biodiversity, on management practice, on how to improve food security, etc. On the to use and integrate existing assessment and monitoring system, including those developed for the Sustainable Development Goals, the CBD, the Commission, and to strengthen the roles of citizen scientists, indigenous people, local communities, and other stakeholders. Next slide, please. The strategic priority 2.1 is about promoting sustainable use of biodiversity for food and agriculture and integrated approaches to its management. So the rationale behind is that although the adoption of these practices, the biodiversity-friendly practices, is reported to be increasing, such approaches and practices should be more widely applied. However, there are difficulties: lack of research, of knowledge, capacity, resources, or appropriate legal, policy, and administrative frameworks. So many of these practices are relatively complex, require a good understanding of the species composition of the ecosystem, the relationships between these species, the ecosystem, and their interaction with other interdependent ecosystems. And finally, such practices, as mentioned before, can be very knowledge intensive and context specific and may provide benefit in the long term rather than in the short term. So the framework foresees 9 actions to address this situation, again aggregated here at a higher level. And these actions are to promote the sustainable food and agricultural practices and approaches, including measures to reduce inappropriate use of chemical pesticides or excess use of fertilizers or reduce the impact of overgrazing, etc. Identify and develop methodologies on the basis of best management practices, including those based on indigenous and local knowledge, to promote production systems that serve several purposes and improve landscape structure and connectivity. Next slide, please. The rationale behind strategic priority 2.2 is that although conservation programs have been put in place for a number of genetic resources of species and ecosystems, their coverage and effectiveness need to be improved, particularly in some regions of the world. There are still biological and technical barriers to the long-term conservation of some species, for example, within microorganisms, and the complementarity between in situ and ex situ conservation needs to be enhanced. There is the strong message in the framework that priority should be given to expanding the use of in situ conservation via biodiversity-friendly management practices in all the production systems, including with traditional practices associated with local or indigenous communities. So 4 actions are included under this strategic priority to improve conservation and restoration of biodiversity for food and agriculture. And this includes identifying priority species, ecosystem, and services, to strengthen existing programs, to establish or strengthen infrastructure, to maintain and develop or expand designated areas such as protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. Next slide, please. So the third and last strategic priority area concerns institutional frameworks for biodiversity for food and agriculture. Concerns are raised about the lack of capacity, resources, financial and technical, knowledge, and education. So there are 10 actions under strategic priority 3.1 that address the need to build capacity through awareness raising, research, education, and training. There is another 14 actions under strategic priority 3.2 that address the need to strengthen legal policy and incentive frameworks. For example, legislative, administrative, and policy frameworks, valuation studies, incentive schemes, and other economic instruments, investment decisions, promotion of sustainable consumption and production patterns, access and benefit sharing measures for genetic resources, and food value chains. And finally, the framework stresses that the management of biodiversity spans the boundaries between the sectors of agriculture and nature conservation. It often requires actions across a large geographical scale, for example, across watersheds or along migration routes, and involve a wide range of different stakeholders. There is therefore a need for multi-stakeholder, cross-sectoral, and international cooperation in this regard. And shortages of financial resources is another major constraint to the effective implementation of all the actions that are listed in the framework. So to conclude, 10 actions under the strategic priority 3.3 aim to improve cooperation and funding to address these needs. I will now hand over to Ian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. With this, we come to the conclusion of our presentation. And I think Julie, in her summary, has made it very clear that we need to work together. Enabling frameworks remain insufficient. There has to be coherence and support between all the different instruments that work in the same direction. And that is one of the main linkages between the framework for action on biodiversity for food and agriculture and the global biodiversity framework. One other message was that we cannot have healthy food without a healthy environment. And because of the extent that food production has area-wise and in the global economy, the equation goes also the other way around. We are facing the same drivers as was recognized in the State of the World report. And therefore, sustainable management of biodiversity for food and agriculture is crucial component for the success of the global biodiversity framework. The agriculture sectors are part of this solution, and that has become very clear in the Council resolution. The Council has reiterated the need for FAO, the Commission, and the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture to contribute within their mandate to the development and implementation of the Post-2020 framework. It also invited the Conference of the Parties to the Convention, when adopting the framework, to take into account the instruments by FAO, the Global Plans of Action, the Framework for Action on Biodiversity for Food and Agriculture, the Treaty, and other instruments that are related to the sustainable use of genetic resources for food and agriculture and the wider biodiversity. The Council went even further, and it encouraged FAO to take a leading position in the implementation of the post-2020 framework on issues within its mandate. And therefore, as our Deputy Director General said, FAO stands ready to support its members and the parties to the CBD in implementing the framework in the agricultural sectors. And just as a little reminder that there are already monitoring systems in place and further ones are being developed. I hope with this presentation we have made the close link between the framework for action, on biodiversity for food and agriculture and the global biodiversity framework very clear. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Irene, and thank you, Julie. And indeed, I think you have made this linkage very clear indeed. We need biodiversity for sustainable food and agricultural systems, and we need to focus very much on how we manage food and agricultural systems for the future of biodiversity. And indeed, I'm very pleased to see among the many participants in this webinar that we have participants both involved in the CBD process and those involved in the FAO process, and we will need to continue to work together as we go forward. And now I'd like to invite perspectives on country priorities and needs from to individuals coming from Switzerland and Kenya, respectively, but also leaders in actually the development of this framework. Francois Pétou, the Special Envoy for International Sustainable Agriculture of Switzerland, but the chair of the Commission during the time this framework was developed. And Destereo Niamongo, the Senior Principal Research Officer in the Kenya Agricultural and Livestock Research Organization, and also one of the co-chairs overseeing the fine negotiations of this framework. So now I have the pleasure to hand over to Francois, who will give his perspectives. Francois, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to the Secretariat of the CBD and the FAO for the organization of this webinar in the preparation of the Geneva meeting. We think it's an important issue. Do you see my presentation? Because do you see my presentation?
We do see it. It's not in full presentation mode, but I think.
Okay, so I will.
Yeah.
And now it's okay. Should be okay. Okay, let's go.
Yeah.
So, first, I would like also to thank Julie and Irene for the presentation of the framework. What I will do now is to briefly present the views and priorities of Switzerland on the cluster biodiversity, food and agriculture when it comes to the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, but as well as within the context of the FAO framework for action on biodiversity for food and agriculture. I think it is important also to realize that these two processes were developing in a way in parallel, so our position is basically the same in the two, so which is good. And so I will try now to move to the next one. Okay. What I will so what I would like to see to do now is briefly to address the four pillars of our position. The first one is the link to the transformation of the transformation of agri-food system and the interdependency between this transformation of agro-food system and the CBD objective. And then I will move to the second point, which is the contribution of agro-ecosystem to the goal A on conservation of the GBF. I would also like to address the issue of mainstreaming soil in the GBF, and to conclude with a few words on implementation, synergy, and mutually supportiveness. I have no idea about what you are seeing on your screen. I don't understand exactly why. I don't see my presentation on my screen.
So we're seeing slide 2 at the moment with 4 points.
And you see the next one now?
Yes,
okay.
With 5 points, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. So the transformation of our food system is a critical element for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030. And I think this was really clearly emphasized in different fora. I think the most important one for us this last year was the UN Food System Summit that took place in New York in September. But it is also a very key outcome of the Global Biodiversity Outlook that was published recently. And I think also what is important when we talk about the transformation of the agro-food system is really for us and I think this was clearly emphasized by Maria Elena Acevedo in her introduction, is really the interdependency between this transformation and the biodiversity. So I think we need the transformation to achieve the objectives of the CBD in terms of biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, but also we need biodiversity in order to achieve this transformation of agri-food system. So this slide showed the different levels of actions or entry point for the sustainable transition or transformation of food system. It is adapted from the CFS high-level panel of experts report on agroecological and other innovative approach for sustainable agriculture food system that was published in 2019. Alors, the first, these 5 levels should not necessarily be seen as sequential starting at level 1. Each level represents a potential entry point for developing actions that can contribute to the transformation. And I think what is really important is that when you look at all these levels, they are all related to biodiversity. So the first one, and I think this was already mentioned, the first entry point is really to reduce the threats from agriculture to biodiversity conservation. And I think here, of course, this covers different areas. One is the risk, for example, from pollution linked to the use of pesticide or excess nutrients, but it's also the reduction impact in terms of land use, so trying to limit the surface which is affected to agriculture. And there is also a close link, for example, with the whole issue of incentives, which agriculture incentives that may be harmful for biodiversity. And I think this first entry point is clearly reflected in so far in the global biodiversity framework. For example, targets 7, but also target 8. I don't see the screen, so it's very difficult. But anyway, the second one, I think, is the whole issue of the promotion of sustainable agriculture and food production practices based on sustainable use of biodiversity for food and agriculture. And I think this is this idea of ecological intensification of production. So by promoting this ecological intensification, by promoting biodiversity-based alternative, such, for example, as agroecology as alternatives to conventional practice. And I think from our point of view, this is really what should be addressed under target 10, current target 10 of the global biodiversity framework. It is really focusing on the sustainable use, so the contribution to the people, so in other words, also the functional biodiversity. And this is also addressed in target 10 to a certain extent, also in target 9 and in target 18. The third entry point, but I don't want to develop it too much now because I will commit under the next point, is really to redesign agroecosystem for multiple benefits. The fourth one is the importance. We look really at the whole chain of reconnecting food consumers and biodiversity through the promotion of sustainable and diverse healthy diets. And this is already addressed in the GBF under target 16. And last but not least, I think if we want to achieve this transformation, we need to stop the erosion in terms of genetic resources for food and agriculture and associated biodiversity. And this is also covered by Target 4 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And if you remember, based on the presentation, I think Julie was very clear on her presentation. These are all elements which are also specifically addressed in the framework of action for biodiversity for food and agriculture. So let's move now to the next point, which is the contribution of biodiversity to contribution of the agroecosystem to goal A sorry, before I move to this point, on the previous one, especially on target 10 and target 16, I would like to highlight the results of a joint initiative by Costa Rica, Switzerland, WWF, and CGIAR on GBF and food system transformation. I think this was a 3 years process with a few webinars that were organized, and the outcome of this discussion is a series of proposals on target 10 and target 16 that have been made available to the CBD Secretariat and will be available as information document. The next one on the contribution of agroecosystem to goal A on conservation. I don't want to spend too much time on this one, but just to indicate that from the side of the agriculture, it will be very important for us that the managed ecosystem such as agriculture ecosystem are given the attention they require in the GBF. And one example is, for example, in relation with target 3 on conservation with the objective 30 by 30. And this has, of course, some relevance to the agro-ecosystem, since we think that some agro-ecosystem can contribute this objective. So, for example, by ensuring connectivity between protected areas, but also by direct contributions through other effective area-based conservation measures. And then I would like to move to the next point, which I think is probably also a very important point for us. It's related to maintaining soil in the global biodiversity framework. And we think this is quite a nice illustrative slide. You clearly see the above ground biodiversity and the below ground biodiversity. And I think, unfortunately, even so, soil health as a living resources is essential for the life on Earth. So far in the GBF, we are mainly focusing on above ground biodiversity. In other words, soil biodiversity and soil health is suffering from the invisibility syndrome. So far, in the GBF, nor in the GBF, nor in the monitoring framework, there are reference to soil or soil biodiversity. And a few countries and actors, including Switzerland, EU, and some African countries, have raised this gap and made concrete proposal at the last open-ended working group meeting to integrate soil biodiversity and soil fertility in some specific targets, such as target 7, target 10, and our preference from Switzerland, target 11. And here again, just to conclude on the soil, as mentioned by in the introduction, the soil biodiversity is an important element of the program of work of the Convention on Biological Diversity through the international initiative. And the COP will also have to adopt the revised initiative and the new plan of action for the implementation of these initiative. And I think it will be really strange to have, on one hand, the adoption of this plan of action and no reference to soil in the global biodiversity framework. And now I see time is running. Let me conclude with the next steps, which is implementation which is the mutually supportiveness in implementation. And between the tools developed by FAO and the Global Biodiversity Framework. And here we would like really strongly to welcome in this regard the co-chair proposal in the reflection paper, which is to introduce a new section BBs on guidance for the implementation of the GBF, especially the two first points. The first one, which is important, is the fact that the GBF is a framework for all, not only for the biodiversity community or the environment community, but really for all actors. And I think it will be very important for us also here to mention more specifically the farmers, the foresters, the fishers, and the pastoralists. And also the second point, which is related to the importance of enhancing coherence and synergies for the implementation of the GBF. And I think this issue of synergies is really key for Switzerland. And I think this makes obviously the link on one hand with the FAO convention, which are among the biodiversity related convention, but also the other relevant international process, including the Global Plan of Action and the Framework for Action. I think the importance of the Framework of Action and GPAs for the implementation of the GBF might be obvious for us, but not necessarily for food and agriculture ministries and authorities all over the world. It might therefore be useful to reflect these more specifically also in the COP decision related to adoption of the GBF. And the last slide, and I apologize for the delay, it's really just a little bit to show the evolution during the last 20 years. On the left part, you have a poster that was developed in 2010 for the International Year of Biodiversity, where insisting already on the close link between agriculture and biodiversity. And in 2030, I think the big difference is that we are moving from agriculture to sustainable food system. But I think, and just to show that we have made also significant progress in the last 20 years in bringing together these two elements of biodiversity, food and agriculture. Thank you for your attention, and I give you the floor back.
Thank you very much, Francois, and thanks for really highlighting these linkages and looking at ways we can further strengthen, perhaps in the upcoming negotiations in Geneva, the linkages in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. As I mentioned, we'll come to some questions later, but I just want to mention a couple of practical issues. There is a question of whether the framework's available, whether it's released. It is, and you'll see in the chat a link to the documents that contain the framework, as well as other documents from FAO. I'm sorry that this webinar is in English only. We don't have translation, unfortunately, but I do note that the documents are available in all UN languages on the FAO Commission website, and there's a link also from the documents on the CBD website. So now it's my great pleasure to turn to Desiderio Niamongo from Kenya, who, as I mentioned, also was one of the architects of this framework in his capacity as co-chairing the detailed negotiations in the small group. So Desiderio, now I give you the floor. We look forward to your views on country needs and priorities. Over to you. Thank you. The connection.
Everyone, I will want to start by thanking my previous speakers for.
Okay, this is better. Yeah.
Articulate the Commission Secretariat colleagues. Are you able to get me now? Chair, can you get me?
Sorry, yes, now we can hear you. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Sorry for that interruption. I was given the opportunity to speak on what the country priorities and needs are. The trend now, especially in developing countries, Africa having been identified as a major threat to biodiversity, in spite of being a beneficiary of biodiversity itself. Otherwise, it's moving to very fragile ecosystems because of the population increase and the need to produce food for the growing population. And this is causing unprecedented decline in biodiversity, especially the associated biodiversity for food and agriculture. So our priority, especially in Africa, would be to reduce the threats that not only that come from agriculture, but other practices that threaten the continued survival of biodiversity. So promoting practices that, for example, will enhance the conservation of biodiversity in those ecosystems where agriculture is expanding to, and reducing the use of pesticides that are a threat to continued survival of the biodiversity is critical in our scenario. The sectoral global action plans normally have addressed the issues of assessment, monitoring, and developing tools to monitor the implementation of those actions. Providing resources to actually undertake the actual projects and programs that will enhance the conservation and the use of biodiversity of the sector genetic resources. That, in our opinion, is what has been lacking. So, a lot of importance need to be given to resource mobilization. That this came out very clearly in strategy area 3, where issues of funding are being raised. So to do things differently, if we have to cap the declining trend, we need to focus our efforts in resource mobilization, which will then be geared towards implementing the projects and programs that will address the conservation and the use of genetic resources. Now, securing the effect for food and agriculture is our key priority.
I think we've lost Desterio's connection. At least I can't hear. The stereo, I don't think you can hear, but I'm going to. Yeah, unfortunately, I think we will need to move on to the next speaker, and we have both Basil Van Ave and Francis Ogwell, the co-chairs of the working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework under the CBD, and they're going to give their reflections on the synergies between these two frameworks, and hopefully we can come back to the stereo a little bit later when we have a better connection. So over to you, Basil and or Francis. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And if you need me to interrupt to go back to the stereo, just let me know. Colleagues, it's a pleasure to address you today. So Francis and I will be sharing the time. As we were preparing for this meeting, we went in detail through the framework for action on biodiversity and food and agriculture, and we're going to give you a few reflection. It is not easy to come after Irene and François was done very good analysis, and definitely will be repeating a few points. Clearly, the work you have done is directly related to the action proposed in the current draft of the framework. I won't repeat the list that François and the analysis that François did. You heard it, it's very well done. But I want to point to a few of them and perhaps highlight points where the FAO action can be very helpful. The first one is on the targets addressing the land conversion, and particularly in terms of land use planning and conservation. I think the FAO has a unique opportunity to explain and mainstream what is other effective conservation measures and what land planning can add to the mix. So those are perhaps things you can do even better than we can on the CBD side. I have to mention pollution, and particularly pesticides and nutrients. Definitely, that's going to be some heavy discussion at our upcoming meeting, and I'm looking forward to see how you can help us in the discussion, particularly when it comes to adding specific numbers and numerical aspect to those targets. Repurposing negative incentive, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then I cannot stop before mentioning monitoring and assessment. There is great opportunity for integration. I note very well the point about soil health, and perhaps there is definitively some further conversation to be had in terms of how we characterize soil health, perhaps through the performance indicators and headline indicators. But overall, the report is providing useful language that I hope delegate will consider in the upcoming negotiation. Let's come back to repurposing the negative incentive. We've all witnessed how this language has appeared in the UNFCCC and how we are now have in the Glasgow Pact some language that is very useful to both our community on the FAO and on the CBD side. How can we work together to integrate similar language in our document now that will be helping all of us, including on the climate change? That's one point. The FAO should be commended to working across silo on those issues. This is an example we could all learn from, and perhaps the challenge for Francis and I is how do we capitalize on what you've done to truly make it a framework for all. how Francois has talked about the impact or the influence on the consumer choice, but I think we got to work around all the production system, all the way to the consumer choice, and perhaps we need to move very fast on that, and we need to move on the links to health and climate. How can we work to make a framework that will work and be effective over time, given change in population, consumer demands, and technology? Can we build integrated scenario on nature positive and climate neutral food system and derive from this the change we need in our production system? In the end, given the change we're considering, is the food system and the agri-food system poised for a significant change, if not a revolution? How can we accompany this change and work together, providing leadership and engaging and supporting that change? Are we well equipped structurally to deal with this change? It is clear that we need discrete process in each of our convention on objective and target setting. We also have a biodiversity liaison group that works well at the Secretariat level, but how can we integrate at the delivery level on the ground and have parties engage? So in summary, a very motivating piece of work. Thank you very much. And I cannot stop and pass the floor to Francis Bissar, recognizing once again the hospitality of FAO in 2019 at our last meeting. Francis, over to you.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Thank you, everyone. I think I may also end up repeating a few things that you and the previous speakers have talked about. But in general, we see that a lot of time was taken to develop this framework. 5 years is not a very short time. And therefore, when you read the framework, you really see a very good document that has been prepared. So thank you so much for that effort. I think the challenge will be now to really put this very good piece of work, which is on paper, into action. And I see that this is where the framework should be transforming action at the national level, especially when we're talking about agriculture and biodiversity. We did a study in Uganda. We are looking at mainstreaming biodiversity into the heart of government decision making. We use some criteria to identify sectors that impacts more on biodiversity. We identified energy, we identified agriculture, we identified transport and other sectors, like about 5 of them. But at the end of it, using the criteria, we zeroed, the criteria led us to agriculture as the one that impacts most on biodiversity. In our case here, it impacts for the most part negatively because people need more space to produce food, and all they do is clear the land that is available, whether they are wetlands that's there or if it is forest or whatever. So you find people are producing food, but then the practice is not sustainable. So this is when you read a document like this, you see there's an opportunity to build in that very important angle needed now, that we need sustainable agriculture for us to have really biodiversity also being conserved at the same time. So this agriculture, as we all know, is not negotiable for the most part because food is a necessity. We all need food, irrespective of who we are. And that means food is going to continuously be produced. Therefore, conserving biodiversity at those 3 levels, at genetic, at species, at ecosystem, as food production goes ahead, is going to be very, very important. And I see that this framework has got that opportunity for us to really guide parties at the national level to do that. And the other point I wanted to raise was, of course, not only conversion of whether land or forest into agriculture, but also sometimes there is the element of monoculture taking place. People tend to misunderstand agriculture as a one extensive, large piece of area for one crop. But we, as we see through this framework, we need diversity for food security. one monocrop occupying so many acres of land may be good, but how have we factored in the element of diversity? Because we could easily lose this monocrop or this one crop in one single disease outbreak, and then we'll not have that crop again. So diversity of crops in the agricultural sector, even of livestock in the agricultural sector, is very important. And this framework here, I think in many ways, helps us to get there. So I see that with the effort from FAO, we can move away from that silo of just looking at agriculture, maybe just as producing food, producing a lot of food for people, but also how is the future of agriculture in the long term protected from the biodiversity we so much needed. So this is the link that I see this framework can help us to achieve in the long term. And I think lastly, I would just like to end by again noting, of course, that when you look at this from agriculture, it's so linked to so many targets, as we've heard. In fact, one target not implemented properly could impact on agriculture, one or the other. So most of these targets, whether it is on protected areas, whether it is not reading agriculture directly, but you'll find maybe having more protected areas better managed, you could have habitat for pollinators and others enhanced, and those pollinators will not stay necessarily just in the forest there. They will move in the landscape and pollinate, and so agriculture has a lot to benefit from this post-2020, but also the post-2020 has that to benefit from that. And I think I had a presentation about soil, that need to mainstream soil, the GBF, what people would call maybe below ground biodiversity. And I think this is the beauty of biodiversity. Now, when I'm talking of biodiversity in agricultural sector, I think we are talking in totality there. We may be talking about either below ground biodiversity, we're talking about genetic, you're talking about ecosystem. So we are just talking about the entire biodiversity as we understand it. And I think below ground biodiversity is also implied there. So it will mean that at the national level, when we are talking about agricultural or biodiversity in agricultural sector, we should unpack a lot of elements to the sectors that implement or are going to carry out agricultural activities. I think that is what I needed to add in addition to what the coach has said.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis, and thank you, Basil. And we'll now have the last of our comments before we get to the questions. And I know we are getting a bit short of time, but the last comment now to the chair of the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture in FAO, Deirdre January. Deirdre, over to you.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Chair, for the opportunity. Welcome to all the other participants. Thank you, Mr. Harvey and Mr. Opel, for sharing your views. I'm addressing you today as the Chair of the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. But let me first share with you an important insight on implementation, my experience as national focal point on animal genetic resources for food and agriculture has taught me. Working together with other national focal points from other sectors increases not only cooperation, but also visibility and policy impact of the programs at the highest political level. For example, I teamed up with the focal point on plant genetic resources, and now the minister is well aware about the global plans of action and on animal and plant genetic resources. We were able to trigger action on the ground as well as research. I believe that strengthening such exchange, collaboration, and synergies between the CBD and the Commission focal points will foster the implementation of both the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the Framework for Action on Biodiversity for Food and Agriculture. This is true biodiversity mainstreaming, and the Framework for Action is a new tool in the toolbox. With the Resolution 1/168, the FAO Council invited the Conference of Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity when it will adopt the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to, number one, recognize the importance of sustainable use of components of biodiversity for food and agriculture as a contribution to the conservation and restoration of biodiversity. And number two, take into account the global plans of action, the framework for action on biodiversity for food and agriculture, the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, and other related to the conservation and sustainable use of genetic resources for food and agriculture, negotiated and developed under the aegis of FAO. The framework for action aims at the harmonious implementation of the Commission's global plans of action, the sustainable use and conservation of all biodiversity for food and agriculture, and aims to contribute to the achievement of the SDGs and the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It will complement and support national efforts to implement the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I'm happy to read in the draft elements of the possible decision operationalizing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I quote, recognizing that the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework represents a flexible framework designed to be useful and relevant to all biodiversity-related conventions, agreements, and processes, unquote. For me, as chair of the Commission and national focal point, it would make my mainstreaming efforts and collaboration with the national CBD focal point easier if somewhere in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework or in the COP decision, the Framework for Action on BFA and the Commission's global plans of actions would be mentioned. A link in that would is created at international level is more easily transferred as at national level. More generally, it is important that the food and agriculture sector has some kind of co-ownership when it comes to the post-2020 GBF, and making reference to the framework could help to create this. To conclude, as the last speaker, I have the honor to close the presentation portion of this meeting. We've heard thought-provoking ideas that will be very useful in further aligning the work of the Commission with the work of the CBD, and vice versa, for full delivery of internationally agreed commitments. From my perspective, key messages heard during the webinar are BFA is at the heart of FAO. It's the foundation. We need to work together. We need to reduce the negative impact that agriculture has on BFA, sustainable use and conservation, and then also that healthy environments produces healthy food, and that this national integration is also very important. I wish to thank the CBD Secretariat for co-hosting this event and to show my appreciation to all the speakers that have presented their views and perspectives today. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Deidre, and thank you for all the work of the Commission in developing this framework. And of course, we will count on continued close collaboration with the Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture for the implementation, not only of this framework, but also in supporting the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And I'm sure that the co-chairs and others listening have taken note of your wish that we make these links very explicit as we go forward in the COP as well. Indeed, one of the questions now. I will turn to the questions, although I'll also check in a moment if Desterio can reconnect with us. But I just following on what you were saying about, and in fact what Francis and Basil were saying also about the integration of these two frameworks. There is a question from Daryl Sexton saying that if 80% of the drivers of biodiversity loss are in agriculture, shouldn't this framework be an integral part of the post-2020 framework? Well, perhaps we can't do that directly, but I would perhaps like to hand over to Francis and Basil if they have any comments on how we can ensure at least a very close integration in this respect.
Thank you. I'll start, and Francis may want to add. There is many ways where we can increase the coordination and integration. It starts from providing first in the framework to have good language that makes the links between the two, and that is something that is very possible. Second is to see where we can use parallel language. And that's a strategy that we're using with many others area. And then when it comes to implementation, I think that's where we have the largest potential, starting from science and modeling and how we can have integrated advice to farmers and people active in production, transformation, distribution, and marketing. But beyond that, when it comes to making change and supporting change, working on the regulatory frameworks, the incentive, the funding, what we've seen, and I'm sure you see that, is projects that would perhaps reduce the loss of nutrients are beneficial for biodiversity, they're beneficial for health, they're beneficial for climate. And yet at the local level, it's very difficult for people to integrate funding source. So I'm really interested to explore with you how we can make that a kind of a one window process for people with good ideas to make significant events. So there is many opportunities, and that's just the beginning. I think perhaps as we progress through the next GBF, the format will be such that there will be a single document. But Francis, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Basil. I think just in addition to what you're saying, there are opportunities will come in many ways, I think, because this framework, to me, lays, of course, that very good foundation for us to really make parties or national governments understand the importance of really addressing biodiversity in the agricultural sector. But there are other areas that also we could look at. You know, resource mobilization is going to be a critical part of post-2020. So when it comes to some of those targets that we see directly links to agriculture, is there a way that maybe there could be synergies there on resource mobilization, capacity building? This doesn't end, you know, at government level, at national level. People are leaving employment, new people are being recruited, other things are happening, and they don't. So capacity building is a continuous process, and therefore looking at how you better build capacity of institutions to better handle this. And then in that respect, therefore, transfer of technology that talks to the area or specific agricultural intervention that we're talking about that connects to the post-2020. So some of those are the things I think could help us to integrate better, but I think more can always be identified. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to address now a question from Evelyn Callis, which is how will this framework, the FAO framework, be enforced? So what are the arrangements for monitoring and assessment? And I'll address this question to Irene or Julie.
Thank you, David. I will take it. This framework, like all the global plans of action of the Commission, are voluntary. They are for the national implementation, and they can be used like a toolbox depending on country priorities, because countries are in very different levels of development. They also have very different agroecological and economical and social conditions. And that is also mentioned in the preamble of the framework. The Commission has so far not decided on a monitoring of the implementation of the framework, as the framework covers all the other global plans of action. As I mentioned, there are monitoring aspects in it, and there are aspects that are covered by other initiatives, for example, on the International Initiative for pollinators. And it's also very clear in the framework that there should be no duplication. So I think it is waiting of what comes out from the post-2020 framework, and then seeing how monitoring frameworks, if at all, could be developed and how these all fit together.
Yeah, thank you. And note also that that will, of course, be a monitoring framework of some kind for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And also there's a strong interest in aligning this very closely to the monitoring framework for the Sustainable Development Goals. And we know, of course, that FAO is leading the work on looking at the sustainability of agriculture, indicators for the sustainability of agriculture, and monitoring progress there as well. I'd like to turn to a question, a couple of questions actually, for perhaps Francois and Dedri, on one raised by Didier Babin on subsidies. So, question there: what about harmful subsidies in the framework? And maybe any other comments that you may like to make on those subsidies. And then another question by Philippe Pipart on the idea of connecting food consumers and producers, and what sort of actions do you intend to promote in that sense, and perhaps what sort of actions already included in this FAO framework. I'm not sure which of you would like to go first on this. Francois?
Okay, thank you very much, David, and thank you for the two questions. But I think this brings me to a point I wanted to raise with the two preliminary question, and I think that's the importance of the mutual supportiveness, or between the two processes, means between the CBD on one hand and the discussion which are more focusing on, I would say, agricultural and food policy. If we want to move on a transformation towards more sustainability of agri-food systems, we need the support of instruments like the CBD. You know, because for those of you who have been involved in this discussion related to food and agriculture, if you want to move the agriculture community, I think this takes time, and that's why we need instruments like the CBD or the UNFCCC. And I think this brings me to the point on subsidies. You know, when we discuss the measure related to subsidies, we were not going to develop a new special language on subsidies, but what we did, we used the existing language. So this means that the language which is used in the current framework is the one which was previous to the, I don't remember what was the reference, but if there is some progress within the GBF on these subsidies language and in terms of targets, I think this is also a clear incentive to move within the agricultural community, because like like was mentioned by Irene and Julie, means this framework for action, it's also foreseen as a living document. You know, I think one of the recommendations is to see how this framework for action can be adapted to the final outcome of the discussion on the GBF. So I think, again, I think this is the real importance of the link between the two discussions. The second one is exactly the same. You know, we moved from a really 20 years ago an agricultural based approach. So basically what we were talking at FAO was mainly what are the impacts of the production. And now in the last couple of years, we really moved from this production based approach to a systemic system based approach. And I think that's also something that came clearly from the discussion within the development of the Agenda 2030, but it's also an area where there is a close, there is room for supportiveness between the different instruments, because this whole issue, for example, of using biodiversity as one of the criteria, for example, for the identification of sustainable food products. So how do you use biodiversity for the determination of sustainable food product? I think this is something important. And for this, again, we need the discussion within the biodiversity community. So that's what I wanted to say. Again, really the importance of the linkage and the mutual supportiveness between these two instruments, if we want together to move towards the overall objective, which is these, the SDG and the Agenda 2030.
Thank you very much, Francois. Deidre, do you have any additional remarks?
Like Francois has said, it takes quite time to change. What is the saying? Says it. It's very difficult to teach old dogs new tricks. But what I've tried from my side was to enter, since I'm in government, to enter at the government level and start the sensitizing. They're working it slowly by slowly. 2 days ago, I was able to address our private sector, which deals with marketing of animals, and I could speak there. I could take the global plan of action there. I could take the second state of the world on animal genetic resources there. So to start sensitizing, but you have to work from an angle. And I started slowly working up, because if I get the decision making once to change, to make the move, and that's how I've approached it on this side. And then also supporting that link that Francois was talking about. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We are over time. I'll just acknowledge another one of the other comments that we've received from the participants, and really that's about the role of all the different actors, but particularly the indigenous peoples and local communities. And I think, as Francois mentioned earlier, of course, the role of farmers and fisher folk and other small producers in particular. And in that respect, the relevance of the draft targets 20 and 21 in the post-2020 framework is a comment from Li Ching Lim. I just want to see if we can connect again to Desterio, because we had a problem with his internet a little while ago. Let's see if there's a chance that he could connect. And it would seem not, unfortunately. So apologies for the difficulties we've had technically and with the internet today. So I'd like to thank very much all of the presenters for participating in this webinar, for sharing your knowledge and your views, and even more for all the work that you've done to make the FAO framework a reality, and of course also to our CPD co-chairs for the ongoing hard work on bring into reality, we hope later this year, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I'd also like to really thank all participants in this webinar, some 200 of you, those on the CBD side, those on the FAO side. We hope that this has been a useful opportunity as well to bring these communities together, as I think all the speakers have emphasized. We'll need to continue to work together very closely, both to ensure that we have a sustainable, productive and healthy agriculture, and that we protect biodiversity, use it sustainably, share the benefits equitably. So thank you all very much, and we'll now draw this webinar to a close.